Everyone. I would like to welcome each member of our panelists as well as our audience to our conference tonight titled Minority of a Minority, the Shia Muslim Student Experience. Today, we're going to discuss the impact and significance of Shia chaplaincy and leadership on college campuses and Shia student development. I would like to introduce myself. My name is Melanie Mohsen, and I am a master's student at George Washington University, studying Islamic studies with a concentration in Shia Islam. I'm also a graduate research assistant at the Islamic Center at New York University and Mufid Academic Seminary at George Washington University. I would just like to let everyone know that throughout our conference this evening, we will be accepting questions, and we have our question and answer function. So just feel free to drop any questions that you may have in the chat. I would also like to extend a very warm welcome and thank you to the Steinhardt School of Education, the Lewis Foundation, and with a special gratitude towards Professor Jim Fraser. Thank you to all of our co-sponsorships as well. And without any further delay, I would like to introduce our first panelist, Sheikh Faiyaz Jaffer. He is a research scholar for the Islamic Center at New York University, as well as a chaplain at the Center of Global and Spiritual Life at NYU. He's currently a doctoral candidate at NYU's Steinhardt School of Education, and he's working on his doctoral project titled Minority of a Minority after this event. And Sheikh Faiyaz also got his MA degree in Islamic Studies from the UK with a concentration on early Islamic history after his undergraduate degree from Stony Brook University in Political Science and Religious Studies. Sheikh Faiyaz has also studied in the Seminary of Karbala, Iraq, one of the most prominent centers for Islamic learning. And Sheikh Faiyaz is a religious leader across North America. So my first question for you tonight to kind of define our entire discussion is, how would you define Shia Muslims, and why is this conversation important at all, especially in the realm of higher education? Thank you, Sheikh Faiyaz.
Yeah, no, thank you, Melanie, and thank you to everyone for joining and participating in our conversation this evening. And also, of course, special thanks and gratitude to Steinhardt School of Education and Lewis Foundation for supporting our program, in addition to all of our wonderful co-sponsors and participants. Yeah, I think for sure, the most important thing for us to do, firstly and foremostly, before we invite our real experts, is to perhaps frame the conversation with regards to why this conversation is important in the first place. When we talk about Muslims in America, we estimate that approximately 1 to 3% of the population of Americans is Muslim. So we're estimating between 1.1 and 3.1 million Muslims in the United States. And when you take a look and you try to break down that number even further into different ethnicities, into different theological schools and different groups, that number obviously becomes a lot more differentiated and segmented via the population and the diversity of the Muslim community in the United States. And personally, in my role in faith leadership, I strongly believe in sort of the importance of building power and strategizing as a larger Muslim community, whereby we can work toward the common core values that we're all seeking in this country, which is to create a better system of life for ourselves and for our families and for our children, and hopefully sort of create opportunities and avenues that distance ourselves from a lot of the sort of Islamophobic rhetoric that Muslims have been dealing with since, forever. And that brings me then to the sort of central and sort of important conversation that we're having this evening, which is regard to specifically the Shia Muslim student community in the United States. Like I said before, if we estimate that between 1 and 3% of the Muslim population in the United States is Muslim, or 1 to 3% of the larger population of the United States is Muslim, we estimate that approximately 10 to 15% of the global Muslim population are Shia Muslims. So we're talking about a really, really small, meaning 10 to 15% of 1%. I'll stick to theology. I'm not that good in math. A really, really, really small number of Shia Muslims on college campuses. And during the course of the last, 5 or 6 years, but probably even if we rewind that a little bit further, post 9/11, and even if we rewind a little bit further, rhetoric around Muslim communities, the language often used to describe Islam is harsh, to say the least. And for Muslims who are seeking a sort of sense of belonging on their respective campus, whereby they're looking to embrace the opportunity that they have to being in a diverse place and be a student. What do students have challenges with? They have challenges with education, they have challenges with finances, they have challenges with similar challenges that every other student might deal with. Muslim students, of course, encounter all of those things. And when we talk about the sort of unduly rhetoric around Muslim communities, it's important to recognize that institutions of higher education are many a times a microcosm of their respective communities more broadly. So I work at New York University, and I believe that the climate at New York University is a product of the larger environment of Lower Manhattan. And I would argue that most campuses all across the country are very similar in that regard, that they are a microcosm of the community that surrounds it. And so when a Muslim student comes to campus, they seek, a good education, they seek comfort, they seek friendship, they seek an embracement of their social identity. And for many Muslim students, they're able to fulfill those needs. Many of them, of course, they're not, again, due to a lot of the sort of national political rhetoric that surrounds them. But that becomes even more challenging for the minority Muslim community, particularly for the sake of our conversation, the Shia Muslim community. Because when you start breaking down those numbers, we're talking about a really, really small number of individuals. When they enter into a space, a Muslim student organization, a group, an Islamic center on their respective campus, for many of them, they're not feeling isolated due to the Islamophobic rhetoric solely that they're encountering on a day-to-day basis, but they're also feeling isolated many a times by the larger Muslim community on campus who fails to recognize the nuance of their, of their theology, of their practice, of that which is really, really important to their respective faith. So I guess to answer your question, Melanie, to start the conversation and perhaps define why this is really, really important. On many campuses all across the United States, where I work at New York University or anywhere else across this country, there is a group of individuals known as Shia Muslims who many a times fail to feel comfort, to fail to express their identity amongst other Muslims. And that in and of itself centers the importance of the conversation. And I think that hopefully during the midst of this conversation, what we're able to also do is recognize that there are a lot of minority religious groups, minority identity groups all across campuses that many at times feel isolated, feel marginalized for any given reason or for a number of given reasons. And that if we're able to center sort of their right to also feel a sense of belonging, that would be really, really crucial. And hopefully together we're able to sort of move forward and make that impact.
Thank you, Sheikh Faiyaz. I feel like you were able to identify Shia Muslims in just a couple of minutes. So thank you very much for your succinct answer. I would also like you to shed some light on this next question. It's a little bit loaded. What does it mean to you to belong to a particular minority identity? And why is it important to have people like you in your position, Shia Muslim chaplain at a university like NYU?
So you broke up for a second. I think it was on my side. Do you mind repeating that?
Oh, of course. What does it mean to belong to a particular minority identity? And why is it important to have people like yourself as a Shia Muslim chaplain at university campuses like you?
I think that every single student has the right to, to seek a good education, to find friends, to find a community on their respective campus. And I think that extends, not only toward religious groups or those who identify with particular religious groups, but anyone and everyone. Wouldn't we all sort of want that opportunity for ourselves, or have had that opportunity for ourselves? And I think that, I speak with students, particularly Shia Muslim students all across the country, who attend, really, really small liberal arts schools, for instance. And when they speak to the fact that they have a particular holiday that they need to commemorate or that they need to celebrate, that they're unheard. These holidays, they've never heard of them before, meaning they're professors, their centers, centers for spiritual life or so on and so forth. And I think that there should be no contradiction in sort of practicing one's religious practice, practicing one's faith, embracing their religious identity, with also going to school and being like a good student or going to work, right? Of course, recognizing that, we live in a, we live in a country and we live in a system that sort of, is very sort of Christian normative or Protestant normative. All of our institutions, from, the way that our weeks are structured, right? We go to school and we work from Monday to Friday, yet Saturday and Sunday we're off, right? Which again, all sort of fits in and molds into this sort of white Christian privilege that we recognize that we live under the guise of. And I think that we have the opportunity to sort of push those things a little bit where we can, because every single individual, and particularly those who, subscribe to a particular faith tradition, they should feel the opportunity to grow, right, in their religious tradition, but at the same time be the best that they can be in their academics and in their careers. And so that's why I think that, again, this conversation is so important. And the fact that anyone and everyone should have those similar opportunities to grow naturally and to cultivate themselves and not have to, isolate either their education or their religious identity.
Thank you again. And as a graduate from New York University, I can definitely speak to the unique presence that you offered me and just kind of the transformational experience that I was able to, because of all of the experiences such as Umrah and Ziyarat, and just kind of having you there as a figure of support and mentorship really impacted me myself.
Appreciate that. Thank you.
Of course. I want to ask you one last question before we move on, because I think this is very important. But what makes Shia Muslim chaplaincy unique as opposed to having a general Muslim chaplain on university campuses?
I think it's unique because at the very least, it's an opportunity for others to see that we appreciate and recognize the diversity within the Muslim community. I think that even those who may not have been, students at New York University like yourself, they see that there is a community that does sort of understand or hears them, so to say. And I think that suffices. When people know that there is a space that's available, it gives them the confidence to act on their respective campus, right? Naturally, when you're watching TV and you see someone who comes from your sort of ethnic community or who comes from your religion, right? You feel proud because you say, oh, like that person's like from me, even though they never heard of you before and you never spoken to them before. You just feel good about the fact that someone else shares their identity and that they're sort of in the public. And I think that, and I'm sort of very humbled by the opportunity, but the fact that, students can look at, our institution, and of course there's a lot of work to be done and it's not perfect and we never get complacent and there are certainly obstacles and hurdles, but at least, there are students who can take a look and see and say like, look, we have some representation. And, when students, again, in these really, really small liberal arts schools all across the country, they send me an email and they tell me that it's a really it's a nice feeling. Alhamdulillah.
Thank you, Sheikh Faiyaz. I would like to shift to one of our next panelists. I would like to introduce Professor David Coolidge, and he's currently a PhD student at the Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley, California. And from 2008 to 2013, he worked as a Muslim chaplain, first at Dartmouth College and then at Brown University. And then after that, from 2014 to 2017, he taught an undergraduate course on Islamic law and ethics at New York University. And he has also served on the boards of various American Muslim institutions, including Zaytuna College and Talif Collective. Thank you for joining us, Professor Coolidge. I do want to ask you one question to sort of begin our conversation, and then I'll let you take it away. As a former chaplain and someone who's been very involved in community work, what are some important things that you think everyone here should know in regards to how Shia students can find some sense of belonging and however you define the belonging on college campuses? Thank you.
Thank you for having me. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. الحمد لله الذي علم بالقلم علم الإنسان ما لم يعلم وصلى الله على محمد وآله وسلم. Assalamu alaikum. May peace be upon you, to everyone who's listening. Thanks for including me in this conversation. From the institutional perspective, from the perspective of university administrators, there's often a great desire to meet the needs of the student population within the potential limits of, often the budget of the school in question. And so those schools that have, allocated funds towards Muslim chaplaincy, for example, or towards programming for Muslim student life, there's generally just a broad awareness of, the needs of Muslim students, that might fall under examples of, well, we know that Muslims fast during the month of Ramadan, so is there something we should be doing to assist those students? We know that Muslims gather for, Salatul Jummah, the Friday prayers. Are we meeting their needs, their space needs for accommodation? There's not too much awareness of the specificities of any particular sort of tradition within Islam, whether they be, Salafi or Sufi or Shi'i or Ibadi or anything like that, right? What generally administrators understand is the very broad conception of Islam, what you might actually call al-ma'lum min ad-din bid-darura, that which is necessarily known to be of the religion. We know Muslims don't eat pork. We know they fast the month of Ramadan. We know they pray towards Mecca, things like that. So, even if you had an institution that has a lot of money to put towards, religious life, and let's keep in mind that that has to be a private institution. That can't be a public institution like Rutgers University in New Jersey or University of California, Berkeley over here on the West Coast. Those institutions can't put money towards those sorts of things. They can accommodate student life in terms of, for example, if the MSA comes and says we need a space for Salatul Jummah, they can make space for it, but they can't devote money towards it the way a private institution can. But let's say a private institution has the money and wants to put it towards Muslim life, we'll put it, to give it a term, they will generally go for what they think is the broadest needs of the community. And in terms of the feedback loop to the administration, it will be filtered through whoever is vocal, right? So if it's, the MSA leadership, for example, and the MSA leadership has only Sunnis on the board, right? Then they're the main conduit by which there's some sort of feedback to the administration. The administration will probably not be aware of the issue of, Sunni-Shia relations, for example. They will just see it all as Muslim life, just as, a group of Muslims. And that's, not to fault them, not necessarily knowing all of those details. But what it makes us realize is that students, faculty, and staff who are aware of these things have to be vocal and have to make it known what their needs are. So at a university, for example, where there might be a Shia Muslim faculty member, that faculty member, to a certain extent, has a responsibility to, speak on behalf of the needs of the Shia community and make it known. Even, let's say, for example, if they're not an Islamic studies professor, but they're a physics professor, but they happen to be a Shia Muslim, but that may be one of the few people on campus that can make the needs of, not only Shia students, but other Shias in the university community represented to the administration. But that obviously that doesn't always happen for many different reasons. And so, we need to be aware of those feedback loops and the way in which, sometimes the marginalization is just because, the administration is actually just unaware of those specificities, right? So we know, for example, that NYU, mashallah, is the only college campus in the entire country where for the 10, nights of Muharram, there is a commemoration. And so NYU is unique compared to the other thousands of colleges and universities across this country. And we know, for example, that, at some schools that have very, very large Muslim populations, there has been, for example, the need to split between what was historically just the MSA, the Muslim Students Association, which has a history of being a predominantly Sunni organization, and the Ahlul Bayt Students Association, which has emerged to represent the needs of larger Shia student populations, especially at state schools, where you need to have a lot of grassroots support. But then I think in addition to this, we also need to keep in mind, and the broader dynamics of our community, whereas, one of the few people that I know that has kind of lived between both the Shia and the Sunni community, and speaking from my life experience, they often exist in parallel and in, not much interaction with each other. And the way that that larger experience filters out onto the college experience means that a lot of the more difficult conversations and the more difficult interactions have yet to happen. Because, you take Chicago, where I grew up, for example. I mean, there's a Sunni masjid here, and then down, the other suburb, there's a Shia masjid there, and never the twain shall meet, right? They may both speak Urdu, they may both be filled with doctors and engineers, but there's not a lot of, conversation between them. I mean, maybe they know each other in some more secular setting, like we have a Shia doctor and a Sunni doctor who, say salam to each other in the operating room, but then they don't get together at the masjid. And so, what the reality is that on college campuses, a lot of times, these difficult conversations are happening for the first time in people's kind of collective Muslim life, because outside of college, they've been able to do things separately. And so I give just one example of a chaplain who, is Shia and was raised Shia, but essentially because of the lack of awareness of the Shia tradition in the congregation that they were a part of, essentially was in taqiyya, essentially was hiding their Shia-ness, and did not want it to be known publicly that they were a Shia Muslim, because they felt that that would hamper the work that they were trying to do on behalf of all Muslims. And that was not something that was coming from the administration, but that was something that was coming from the broader student community and the local community that was participating in that student community. And so when we recognize those dynamics, we have a greater understanding of the situation that we face to create a healthy and unified Muslim life on campus. And I'll just give one last anecdote just to highlight from my own personal experience. When I first became the chaplain at Brown University, we had an older African-American man who was regularly come to our Salatul Jummah, who was not part of the campus community because our Jummah was open to anyone who would like to come. So he was coming regularly. So 1 week before Salatul Jummah, and this was back when I was Sunni, I just said, hey, would you like to give the adhan before the khutbah this week? And he was like, are you sure? And I was like, yeah. He was like, so I'm Shia. And I was like, no problem, right? I don't think anyone's gonna have a problem with it. And so then he got up and he gave the adhan in the Shia way. And one, nobody had a problem with it, but two, he was so shocked and thankful to even be given that experience that it was a truly groundbreaking thing for him. And it was because he had never been in a space where that had been possible. And so, a chaplain can, have an impact in this congregational space in a way that they probably could not in many masjid communities, because there is a greater openness and a greater willingness to see things in a different light. So I'll end with that and we can keep on going. Assalamu alaikum.
Thank you, Professor Coolidge. And I think your discussion hit a lot of the audience. We got a lot of questions and we will be answering them. And we will also be having a question and answer towards the end. So keep on asking questions and thank you for asking them. I would like to move our discussion to Shereen. And Shereen is a graduate student at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where she studies rhetoric, politics, and culture. And her research focuses mainly on Shia youth communities in the United States. I think something that I really wanted to ask you is why does the way that Shia youth groups organize on college campuses matter? How does this affect maybe their religious identity on campus or during their college experience? And why is this important to discuss? Thank you, Shereen.
Hey, walaikum salam. How are you guys? I also wanted to begin by first saying thank you for having me on this really important discussion. I'm really humbled to be here. And I mean, to be honest, getting into like researching Shia communities is something that's relatively still new in terms of my research, just because of the fact that it's been so personal and because it's also been ripe with levels of like, you know, anxiety and struggling, right? So in a lot of ways, I can speak from, you know, experience rather than just kind of defaulting to like a lot of research that I've been doing. But, you know, to the question about like having Shia spaces on campus, I mean, I feel like one of the big things that when I was myself an undergrad was that, you know, I went to different schools. I went to a community college. I went to, you know, a different school after that. And I wanted to say that, yeah, see our Muslim chaplain from DePaul is also representing. Thank you, I appreciate you being here. But like, I went from one institution that was actually very blatantly anti-Shia, like the Muslim student group over there they weren't just like ignoring Shias, but they were just very like, I remember when the Islamic New Year began, they sent an email out to all of the Muslim students and it was like, welcome to the new Islamic year. And then they had a Q&A section of like, well, you know, what about Muslims that celebrate the new year? And it said, the Sheikh responded, no, that's, you really shouldn't do that. And then it says, what about those Muslims that grieve the beginning of the new year because of whatever they believe? And then this like response from the Sheikh was like, these are the Gaffers of the Gaffers, right? They're the unbelievers of the unbelievers, of the worst of the worst. They're going to be the depths of hell. Like I was like, what? This is like to a whole other level, right? And I think on a personal level, I became super, super Shia after that. And transferring to the next school ended up being a very different experience in the sense that I was not only nominated to be part of the Muslim student organization at that campus, but I was actually like voted in as the vice president. And it became something that like we were able to like have, you know, space to have programs here and there. But I will say that, again, I'm talking from my experience, which has been so varied and scattered, that I've also, you know, in the process of having to like put together programming and represent Shias or answer questions about Shia Muslims in various capacities, one of the most anxiety inducing things that I did do was like publish blog pieces about this. I was invited to write about like the Shia perspective for different Ramadan blog series like years ago before I started my PhD program at UW. And the people that had asked me to write about it were themselves Sunni. And it was because like largely in part of the support that I got from my Sunni friends and from, you know, from my Sunni friends, from my like Sunni advocates that were actually saying like, oh, not only did I not know, speaking to the points that, you know, David and Sheikh Faiyaz have brought up as well, that like we didn't know these things about Shiism, but like the fact that I didn't have to have conversations and be like in defense mode, right? I didn't have to be like constantly defending, well, why do Shias do this, right? So I felt like because of those experiences, because of having that level of support and upliftment, that I was able to kind of go beyond just like, oh, I am, you know, kind of unapologetically, you know, Shia on a personal level, and actually be bold enough to take it outside of just me and write about it beyond that scope. And so I think that when we think about like what it would mean to have that space for Shia students on campus, I mean, and I'm also going to say this not only as someone who has been a Shia student, but someone who's worked within university systems on multiple levels, right? I've been an adjunct, I've been a grad student, been a teaching assistant, all of those things. As a general rule of thumb, like I think that for, and I know that administrators might be listening to this, this is why I'm saying this at this point right here. I think that it's definitely worth it to invest in those students that might feel like the most marginalized in that way. Because if we think about it, like, if we think about how much Shia communities, and I want to bring in one more example before I finish off this answer. But if we think about like how much progress communities can make just because they have to fight to survive, right? Just because they have to fight for that presence. Can we imagine what we could expect from students if they weren't like fighting for a presence, right? So instead of like constantly using their energy and their resources towards like, can we just have a voice, right? If they felt supported, if they felt uplifted, I think that would be to the benefit of the entire institution, right? And I say this like beyond even just like Shia students, you know, as a general like rule of thumb that I would want to send to administrators is like, it might be worth it to invest in those marginalized students. Because I know that that's always something that universities are having to like deal with, right, and confront. And the one last example I wanted to kind of bring up, so as I said, I personally grew up in the Chicagoland area, but I definitely wanted to share this, and I wanted to share it too for the folks that are listening too. I feel like, as I mentioned before, like one of the things that was really profound for me was being able to kind of be like unapologetically Shia, you know, in that way with my Sunni friends. But I think one of the questions that comes up a lot, and I don't know, I hope I'm not going into like another question by saying this point, but I think the other question that comes up is like, well, how do you go about doing that kind of work? And I feel like there are some examples out there of what that could look like, right? And so specifically, I wanted to point out that having a Shia presence is more than just having like a Shia panelist on something, right? Or like citing a Sunni scholar in like some sort of like programming, right? Muslim-based programming that is itself like really not really changing anything, right? It's the same kind of critique that we have of diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives, whether that be on campus or elsewhere, is that it's great that you want to bring in representation of different backgrounds, but you know, the problem isn't always the actual, it's not just the fact that like, it's just kind of sprinkling diversity on, right? If the problem is actually the structure of the institution, you know, bringing in a Black, you know, administrator on a lower level is not going to change an institution that is constantly servicing those that have privilege, those who have class background, who are white, right? So you have to consider like, what are the institutional shifts that we can make? So Shia chaplaincy is definitely an example of what that looks like, right? But even like preceding that, like as someone who was growing up in Chicago, like I remember hearing about these like Muharram in Manhattan programs that were happening. And I bring that up just to say that like, this is an example of taking like a practice that is prominent within the Shia community, these gatherings of communal grieving, of reciting poetry, et cetera, and making that a space for the whole community, Sunnis and Shias, to connect, right? So in a lot of ways, it's a great example of how in this area, right, around NYU, and I think this actually preceded a lot of like the NYU, you know, Shia chaplaincy. So it's almost like something that created like an energy and a buzz of comfort that allowed for that to then, you know, come into fruition. So I hope that, you know, I know it was a little disconnected, but I hope that answered the questions that you were posing.
Yes, thank you so much, Shereen, and thank you for being so willing to share your experiences. I would definitely also highlight the importance of having Shia leadership, and especially for college students to take those leadership positions. So thank you. And I wanted to ask you another question, because I'm also a graduate student and I do my own research. So I wanted to ask you about your research. I have one question that I really would like to answer, but you can take this any way you want. I just would really, and I'm sure all of us would gain from hearing a little bit more about your research findings and whatever you're comfortable sharing with us. But how have, in your research, how have Shia youth groups been organizing both on campus and on university settings? And how do you think that this shapes the upcoming generation of Shia youth?
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, I feel like Brother David's response was actually really good about that, because that's exactly what my experience has been as well. And some of the research that I've been doing has been helping. So just to offer kind of a clarification and some backdrop too. So I'm in the Rhetoric, Politics, and Culture program. Broadly speaking, I'm actually interested in how like Muslims articulate Muslimness just within their own communities. And this can be in relation to race, you know, gender, and of course, madhab, school of thought. And so, I mean, I've always had a lot of ideas about taking the Shia stuff that I've been reading about and the experiences that I've had in community and going to different community sites and making that scholarship. But that's something I've actually always been afraid to actually do, like write about too officially, because my experience as I'm just going to be blunt and honest, like my experience as a grad student sometimes has been like confronting a lot of people who aren't even Muslim and who don't know the differences between Sunni and Shia, and almost feeling like we're being treated like an anthropological study. And that just really terrifies me. I'm worried about how the scholarship will be taken up. I care too much about our communities for it to be taken up in a problematic way. So, and because it's just like, for me, talking about Shiaism and talking about the Shia community is just me being very vulnerable. Anyways, all that being said, for now, for my dissertation, I'm actually working with a great organization, the Shia Racial Justice Coalition, in putting together an anti-racism curriculum for members of the 12-verse Shia community. And the purpose behind that is kind of aligns with my research interests, which is, you know, how do we within our own communities talk about these issues that are important to us? And how do we then address those issues in ways that are palatable to our communities, right? So I think that, you know, given that what we've talked about Shia communities being, you know, a little, what's it called? That we do have Shia practices that are different and sometimes like are not always visible to the mainstream Sunni Muslim community. That it's important that we have, you know, language that caters to them specifically. And as far as what it will do for students on campus, I mean, like Brother Dave said, right? Like this is the first time where, forget just like you're gonna like talk to Sunnis and have like these intra-faith discussions. That, for me, college was the first time I met like an Iranian Shia, because their center was like down the street, you know, from mine. But because I'm not Iranian, because I'm South Asian, I never even knew that these Iranians were here. I didn't know that these Iraqis were here. So it's kind of like you know, find the space to come together. You have space to like, again, find that verbiage and connect in that way. And you're also not necessarily confined to, I don't want to say confined, maybe that's the wrong word, but it's like when you're in your community spaces, there is a particular way that you are going to behave, especially if you're young, right? Like that's a whole other topic of like how young people are sometimes treated in the centers. But here as students, I feel like the research out there about student organizing and activism changing like the mold of this country is like wide reaching, right? So of course, when students come together, they can really make powerful things happen on campus. So like I said, I haven't done like too much in-depth like research, but just from like my exchanges and what I've witnessed, I feel like they've been pretty powerful.
Thank you, Shereen. I'm praying for your success, and I know that your research will be an invaluable resource for Shia students as well as administrators. So thank you for sharing your thoughts. I would like to ask our next panelist some questions, and I would like to introduce Laila Tauqeer, who currently serves as the Executive Director at Next Wave Muslim Initiative, a community organization based in the DMV area, working towards nurturing the next generations of Muslims. In 2019, she founded Marafa, a national nonprofit to serve Shia Muslim students, and she also directed 2 national conferences and designed a college preparation mentorship program for Shia youth. She's a graduate from Harvard University with a bachelor's in history of science and a secondary in Near Eastern Studies in May 2021. Thank you, Laila, for joining us. And I do have a question I would love to ask you first. What does your ideal vision for future Shia youth leadership specifically on college campuses, what does that look like for you? Thank you, Laila.
Thank you, Salam. It's so good to be here among you all, especially now that I'm entering more of that community organizing space and seeing you all in that space for years. It's like really nice to be among everyone. And thank you for having me here too. So as for the question, so for those who are unfamiliar with Shia youth leadership, I do want to be very specific about, like, when I say Shia youth leadership, I mean Shia students who are working to create spiritual and intellectual spaces for other students, or chaplains or scholars who are working with young people to create those spaces. So not just like a Shia person in a leadership position anywhere. So that distinction. And some examples of this are, say, like youth groups at mosques comprised of like 13 to 25-year-old young people doing work in youth organizations, or Ahlul Bayt chairs in Muslim students associations. So having a specific position just for Shia programming in the broader MSA, or having an ABSA, so Ahlul Bayt Students Association, similar to what an MSA is, but for Shia students, comprised of Shia students. And then the other part of it outside of students is people like Sheikh Faiyaz and David Coolidge, who are working with young people, and Shereen's research that provides resources for folks who are doing this work to see like what is needed in the community. So all of that comprising like what Shia youth leadership means on college campuses. And just to lay out the groundwork for where we are in Shia leadership, or what I think where we are at, is that I think we've done such a great job at establishing these positions. Sheikh Faiyaz mentioned ABSA Network in one of the answers. And ABSA Network is an organization that helps students establish other ABSAs on their college campuses. So there is this institutional support that has been in place since I've been in college, at least. So we have ABSAs popping up in schools in California, and we've had them in Texas for a couple of years. We have a lot of Ahlul Bayt chairs popping up in the Northeast, simply because there aren't enough students to start, a separate organization from an MSA. And a lot of things happening in Canada too, and because of the Zoom world, there's a lot of collaboration happening. And there's also abbreviations in the chat. We're not creative with our names, so it's just, different versions of saying Ahlul Bayt. So a lot of collaborations happening between Canada and US students. And then what we saw after Ma'arifa, where Shia students got to see each other in person, and right after that everything went online, was that students were collaborating and creating organizations independent of their schools or their mosques. So we saw a lot of creative energy coming out of that too. Like now we have Shia Racial Justice Coalition, we have Ahlul Bayt Collective that's focused specifically on Shia creatives. We have organizations that are focused on English language recitation, and they're not connected with anything. They're just there because students wanted to do that. So I think we've done a wonderful job at that. As for like what we need to do now and like what the vision is looking like for future, I divided it into 2 parts. One is like the outside support that other people can give students, and the second part is like the students doing that work on their own. So the first one is like for, I think we are past the representation stage on many college campuses. We have the representation, it exists. And even if anti-Shia rhetoric exists, there is enough support in place that you can do what you need to do to move past that and still continue doing your own programming. But the problem now is the institutional support and chaplaincy. Like it is a waste of time to put 4 years of your life into work on a college campus doing Shia programming, and then you leave and there's nothing left after that. Because there's just no institutional support. So that's where like chaplaincy comes into play. And I think it's unfair for universities, for majority Sunni spaces, and for the Shia community to leave all of this up to Shia students. And I say like the Shia community in this too, because our community does not value youth programming the way that it should. And it falls on students to do it on their own on college campuses while we're also trying to build our own spiritual development, right? Like this programming is so much more than just doing the program. Like what about the learning of the people who are putting all of these things on? So like you're doing this programming for other students and for your Sunni counterparts, and it means nothing at the end of the day if we ourselves don't have anyone to turn to ask questions about God, to ask questions about our imams, to ask questions about religion, or even to ask questions about like, how is religion relevant to all the things that you're seeing in your university? So you're basically on your own in your own little bubble doing this programming when you yourself don't know what like Shia Islam is. So who do you turn to when it comes to that? And I think that's where our community owes it to us to have support from scholars and chaplains. And that's where the universities come into play too, which is going to be a much longer fight. Like Harvard, for example, had its first Muslim chaplain when I was a first year, so 4 years ago, really recent. So like that's an uphill battle to begin with. So that's one thing, to have institutional support and have our communities give that to us. And the second part is directed more towards students who are hopefully in attendance here. For students to do this work authentically, not merely because you're not like just the Ahlul Bayt chair of an MSA, because of an identity or diversity, or because you too want a seat at the table, but because your leadership actually enhances the Shia spiritual and intellectual landscape. What is the point of graduating and saying that I established this position when you yourself did not grow in your Islam and the students around you did not grow in their Islam? So moving beyond just the identity part of it, and it's so easy to reduce Shia leadership to just that, to stop once you've received the representation. If we stop at that, then it just becomes a social club for Shia students. Which I guess it has its own merit. You want social interactions with other Muslim students. But I really don't think that's the end goal for our community. And I don't think that's why people start those organizations to begin with. So I do want like students and scholars to sit down and figure out what it means to have Shia programming. Like what does the phrase Shia programming mean? What does that look like, and what are the end goals? And that's a lot of internal work for us. And to me, like authentic Shia youth leadership, and this is something I'm not good at yet, looks like living your religion in your leadership and enhancing your own understanding of Islam, and not merely just teaching polemics or trying to teach other people what Shia Islam is when you yourself don't know what Shia Islam is. And it's not like fair to ourselves to enter the Shia organizing space and end our narrative at we are Shia and we are marginalized because we're Shia. And our scholars owe it to us to like push us to learn and practice Islam instead of end our leadership journey on identity. It's like, tell me how like I, as a young Shia, can be a better Muslim, and tell me how I can bring that to my leadership. I think that's what we need in the future of Shia youth leadership. And that comes from scholars setting examples for us to do that. I would hate for us to stop at identity. Like I would hate for us like as students graduating who will eventually end up being, directors of masjid boards, for them to end at that, to end at the fact that if we did programming, that was enough. Like, why did you do the program? And if we don't catch that now in college spaces, we're not going to catch that later. So it's internal work. And So yeah, the future is like for the youth leadership positions to push us all, and especially those in leadership, to become better in our religion and practice it authentically in everything that we do. And I really, really, really hope that our scholars take like that part of it seriously enough to give us that mentorship. That's it from me.
Thank you, Laila. I do have a follow-up question because you spoke so briefly a lot about learning about your values while you're in college and while you were growing and learning as an individual, and what it means to kind of learn beyond just superficial identities and labels. So how have you personally found how to achieve your Shia identity internally, especially from the viewpoint as a college student?
For me, it was finding a lot of external mentors. Not many came from the college campus space. I think it was realizing it was not finding joy in any of the community work I was doing, because I was just doing it to check boxes. And there was this panic moment of what is the point of all of this? And at that point, I had to turn to scholars I trusted and to like academics I trusted to figure out what Shia Islam meant to me, what Islam meant to me, what it meant to practice, what it means to practice it. Because I don't know if you've ever felt it, if you've planned an event and you show up to it and you don't learn anything from the event that you planned, it's a waste of the event. And that's something I think a lot about in my work at Ma'arifah too. Ma'arifah means to know the self and to know God. Imagine like doing 2 Ma'arifah conferences and having absolutely no Ma'arifah. Like no point in doing that. So for me, it was turning a lot to people I trusted and having those conversations and figuring that out. And even now, like setting up check-ins with people who I trust to hold me accountable in my work and in my Islam. And that's where the importance of chaplaincy comes in.
Thank you, Laila. We do have a lot of questions and answers, and I would like to kind of highlight maybe a few of the most important ones. There is one question, and I will first point this to Sheikh Faiyaz. How can Sunni Muslim chaplains fully support Shia students?
I want to pass that on to my friend Dave to answer that question. He has written a really, really important piece some years ago about the same exact question. So Dave, if you don't mind.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Should I press the answer live button since I'm answering it live?
Sure. I don't know anything about technology.
You would like to answer this question live, it seems. All right. Well, I think there's gradations, right? Right. Just to be very blunt, I think we have to recognize that at the bottom level would just be not being belligerent, not, sort of casting aspersions upon the Shia tradition, making snide comments about mutta, making snide comments about, cutting yourself, flexing, what the beauty of what you think your tradition is. Well, my sheikh and my tradition is so beautiful and loving and merciful, and yours is a cult of hate kind of stuff, which is unfortunately is a reality. So not doing that is, the lowest common denominator. Right? And at the other end of the spectrum would be someone who actually not, even if they weren't Shia themselves, was learned in the Shia tradition, had studied with Shia ulama, had perhaps done ziyarah to Imam Hussein, in Karbala, and Imam Ali in Najaf, out of recognition that they are their leaders too, from a Sunni perspective. And so could speak competently what it's like, when I first went on ziyarah, it's like all the Shias in my life are like, yeah, we go to ziyarah in Iraq all the time. And all the Sunnis were like, oh my God, you're going to Iraq. It's just I even had a Sunni scholar and they call me on the phone and tell me you shouldn't go because it's a land of fitna. And, but if someone had actually been and had a good experience and just realized you can go to Egypt and you can go to Jordan, which as many people do who go to college, they go study Arabic in Egypt or Jordan. You can go to Iraq too, and it'll be okay, inshallah. And not make it some no-go zone. Right. So if you have a chaplain that's at that level, right, then they can actually much more competently serve the needs of the Shia community. Maybe they can't, lead a majlis, right? But then that would be somebody who would sympathetically, for example, bring in someone to lead a majlis if that was the need of, the community or whatever else it was, as Laila was saying, if they recognized that the students really wanted and needed some further, deeper education, they would be open and willing to provide that resource. And would be comfortable facilitating that. So in that light, I would like to, make a reference to Imam Sahib Sultan, my friend, rahmatullahi alayh, may Allah have mercy on him, who passed away, who did exemplify this in his career at Princeton University, and, was very cognizant of this need, and, started an annual majlis program, worked with the Shia community, worked with Shia ulama, and was really trying to get up to speed and leading the way. And obviously, there are other great examples too, but he was a great loss to us, in this regard for the cause of Muslim unity in the United States. There are in between those two examples, right, the sort of very lowest example and then the highest example, there's also many shades of middle ground. But I think that, we can all appreciate that spectrum, recognizing that in one school setting, it actually may be a great step forward to just not, think that Shias are lesser Muslims just because they're Shias. And whereas at another college campus, there's actually like a real powerful and meaningful possibility that the chaplain facilitates for intra-religious education and community building, right? Because I'll just be very blunt. The reason I became Shia, its initial point was because NYU had a majlis program. I had literally been Muslim for 15 years. I had, done all these different study opportunities with all these different shades of sort of Sunni Islam. I had never actually been to a Shia majlis. I just didn't know about any of them happening. But it just so happened that Imam Khalid Latif at NYU had, brought in this Muharram in Manhattan program to have the Shia majlis. And on the very first night, Sheikh Faiyaz was speaking, and I went as this sort of, second Sunni teacher. That I was a sort of volunteer at NYU giving khutbah and, doing halaqas and things. With Khalid's, encouragement. So I felt a responsibility to go as like show Muslim Sunni Shia solidarity, right? And then I go to this first majlis and it blew me away. And I went home that night and I couldn't sleep. And I kept thinking about Imam Hussein and how ignorant I was of Imam Hussein alayhi salam, may peace be upon him. And 1.5 years later, Faiyaz was taking me on ziyarah to Najaf and Karbala. So like I'm a living example of what happens when a chaplain, like in this case, Imam Khalid Latif, is willing to let Shias be Shias and express their feelings and express their traditions. And I was exposed to something that I never really was exposed to, even though I knew more technically about Shiism than many of my Sunni peers, because I had studied books. But al-ilm fi sudur, the knowledge is in the chest, right? It's not in the sutur. It's not in the lines of books, right? So until you have that living experience of, going to a Shia majority place, praying in a Shia majority masjid, studying with a Shia scholar, it will always seem different and other. And so the chaplain has to be, if they're really going to be facilitating this kind of, Muslim community experience, has to be willing to facilitate those kind of possibilities for the students, faculty, and staff on that particular campus.
Can I also just echo something really quickly to kind of piggyback off of that? I think I did mention that for me, one of the impetuses, the things that got me even like bold enough, I really felt like that's what I was going through when I was writing these blog pieces about anti-Shiism. I called it Shiaphobia at the time, right? Was that like having that support from Sunni Muslims meant a lot. One of those experiences that I had was I did a study abroad program in Granada, Spain, and I was only one of like a few Shias, but I mentioned at that program that like, you know, we're reading, it was a critical Muslim studies program. So we're reading a lot of things about liberation theology and stuff, but there wasn't really a lot of Shia representation. So I brought that up just in like conversation. And the response was a few of us ended up organizing a Du'a Kumail session. So it's common within the Shia tradition and Shia communities to read this supplication on Thursday evenings. And you know, the way that I explained it to some of my friends at that school was like, if your soul could talk to God, this is what it would say. And we did a Du'a Kumail program, and it was only like what 2 or 3 Shias, and everybody was like loved it, you know. And it was I had one brother come up to me afterwards. He's like, Shereen, that was right on. Like that was exactly how I felt. So like that's what I mean by having a feeling of not having to be on the defense and answer questions like, why do you pray on rocks? And, you know, these kind of like questions that are a little like clearly coming from like anti-Shia tropes and sentiments, but actually being able to understand the tradition on its terms. So that's one part of it. And the other thing that I wanted to contribute is saying that, you know, having the space to push back and like just recognizing that the more we learn about the different madhabs, the different schools of thought, the more of an asset it can be, right? So if I'm interested in, you know, anti-racism, if I'm interested in how do we fight patriarchy, if I'm interested in like the anti-Blackness that exists in our communities, right? We have had so many scholars. Muslim ARC does, the Muslim Anti-Racism Collaborative does great work on this, right? But you know, like there are other sources out there that aren't part of the Sunni, like, you know, normative doctrine, that are part of the Shia tradition that could be really helpful in generating that discussion, because it's still part of the Islamic tradition, right? So just understanding that like, it's not just something that's kind of, you know, pitifully being done to like be inclusive, right? To get to Laila's point about like, we got to go beyond identity, right? That's not what this is about. There's like actual substance here, and how meaningful that can be when we're not having to be like defensive of that. So I just wanted to add that in there.
Thank you both. And I'll sort of pivot to our next question, as I'm sure a lot of students right now are applying to college and getting ready to make that transition. So we do have a very important question from the audience. What do you advise to the senior high school students to get ready for those challenges at the higher education by working on themselves earlier to maintain their religious identity and appear with a strong personality and powerful steps? Sheikh Faiyaz, why don't you answer this question?
Yeah, I'm going to answer this question perhaps in a couple of folds. The first one is to really center on what our sister Laila mentioned earlier. And even sort of in my experience, I've been working at New York University with students for the past 6 years now. And over the last 3 years, or particularly over the last year, the last phase of my doctoral work, where I interview Shia Muslim students with regards to their experiences. And what's been so unique and incredible for me is that just as I had hypothesized, though I'm not supposed to be hypothesizing in qualitative research, hopefully my professors are not watching right now, I'd assumed that God was going to be very much out of the picture. And unfortunately, that's exactly what I've seen from the students that I have been speaking to. And I think that is primarily due to the environment by which they find themselves, and sort of the centering of conversations around D&I and identity on campus, which I think is super important, but nonetheless, many a times it isolates the opportunity of meaningful spiritual growth. And I think that is a very, very serious problem. Nonetheless, I think that there's an importance of having sort of social identity when you're in college. But the idea is also to take that next step further and sort of grow spiritually, ethically, morally, with the virtues and with the values that, I believe that, this religious tradition that I certainly love and embrace emphasizes. So I would say that, one of those steps that, high school students who are approaching college should really start to think about is, number one, where are they going to find themselves situated? Meaning that they should absolutely look for a campus, for a college community that, again, has that representation, if accessible to them, recognizing that not everyone is in a situation or is afforded the privileges to go and travel toward a community that is perhaps larger and that's more accessible. But in the case that they can, to certainly look out for it. And number two, also to keep sort of the ties with one's respective community. Look, we're never going to be a community of numbers. And that's just a reality of something that we have to embrace as Shia Muslims. Nonetheless, we should be afforded privileges, but as we're working and as all of us on this panel are working in our own ways towards situating and centering the tradition and the narrative, it's important to have access to a religious community that might be off campus that also allows for spiritual growth. So this would be a couple of my quick sort of thoughts with regards to how we can, or particularly how college students can, high school students can sort of transition into college, but also sort of maintaining. And then number three is, going back to that, nonetheless, although I don't think it's the most important thing, but nonetheless, it is still important to invoke and to call out and to be loud and to play this activist role of demanding your rights on campus. You still pay, to sort of be very frank, you pay a lot of money to go to college, right? $40, $50, $60, $70,000 in tuition. And every student has the right to be able to enter into a prayer space and pray the way that they want to. There should be no differentiation between, again, their practice of their religious faith and identity and being a student. So to go in with that sense of confidence, and that where we can be helpful and supportive, where I can be helpful in my own capacity, I think I can speak on behalf of all my friends who are on this panel, that all be more than happy to sort of touch base with any high school student who'd be, who's encountering or undergoing obstacles, challenges on their respective campus, would all be happy to sort of chip in with any pieces of advice that we can potentially offer you, inshallah.
Thank you, Sheikh Faiyaz. As we slowly start to wrap up, I would like to ask each of our panelists one last question, and I'll start backwards this time. This is for Laila. What is your advice for newly started youth groups? And along with this question, if you wanted to just give one piece of advice for any of our youth groups or students, then please go ahead.
Advice for newly started youth groups. I think the biggest thing is to not be reactionary. There's no point in starting a youth group if it's reactionary and if it's redundant. I would say to be kind to yourself and your team and sit down for a couple of weeks and figure out why you want to start something new. If there's work that's already being done and how you can work with that, and what your goals are, like what do you want out of that? Because we start so many things out of reaction to either the Sunni community or within our own community. So I think that would be the biggest things. Once you figure out why you want to do whatever you want to do, and what the goals of it are, everything else will hopefully go by smoothly. But that would be the biggest piece of advice, only because that's the biggest mistake that I see in youth groups, and that's a mistake that I've made multiple times myself.
Thank you, Laila. Shereen, I would also like to ask you, what is one thing that you think we would benefit or what you would want us to take away from your discussion tonight?
It kind of feels like it's similar to what Laila was saying, but it's kind of like not being afraid to, like not necessarily settling. I think that it's important that we engage a level of creativity, I think is one big takeaway, and think about how can we be more mindful of like really centering Shia practices, particularly when, and this is a very common paradigm that's used in other situations. Like I know there's been conversation happening in the chat about like, what about other forms of like marginalized identities within the, Muslim communities, right? And part of the ways that we've responded with like, anti-Blackness is by creating spaces that center Black Muslim voices, that center Black culture, right? And similarly, I think that that's kind of a similar paradigm where we have to kind of think about beyond just like, can we be included or a level of inclusion, right? And again, not reducing it down to identity politics, but going a little bit, further and considering how can we center these practices in meaningful ways to build community, right? That's kind of the goal there. And again, that same note that I said to the administrators before, like students can really be worth the investment. That's the other thing that I would want to put out there for sure.
Thank you, Shereen. Professor Coolidge, I would like to ask you a slightly bigger question. How can the administration, and you spoke a lot about this during your introduction, how can the administration be aware of the complexities of Shia students, and what advice would you give to the college administrations to kind of provide these accommodations for their Shia students and make their college campuses and experiences more inclusive?
As I said before, there's a feedback loop, and the reality is that many college administrators are not particularly aware of a whole host of issues that people face who actually live with those challenges, right? Every college administrator is coming from their own place themselves. And then, in addition to coming from their own place themselves, they are part of a larger conversation amongst other college administrators about what to focus on. And in that attempt, for example, to deal with the diversity of the student population, they will often highlight some things and overlook many other things. And it, for example, will find its way into the literature. So college administrators read something called the Chronicle of Higher Education all the time, or a website called Inside Higher Ed. And, what would actually really get traction would be as if, people who are scholars of the Shia tradition, regardless of their own background, as well as Shias that are involved in higher education, would write things for the Chronicle of Higher Education and Inside Higher Ed, talking about the fact that there are real differences between Muslims. And so just supporting Muslim life is not going to solve every issue, right? You have to have sort of a level of competence and a level of awareness that might, for example, require a very well-educated Muslim chaplain, akin to the sort of ideal type that I gave before, right? So you can, for example, one could write something about Sahib Sultan at Princeton University, rahmatullahi alayhi, and the work that he did, and then show that as an example so that a college administrator who's dealing with these issues actually now has like a name and a face and like a real story about a real institution where something was done. And what was done? Well, one, what was done was that person was open and understanding and empathic and present and aware. On the other hand, right, there was concrete things done where, for example, a majlis was held. I think they called it the annual Imam Hussein Majlis, if I remember correctly, right? So just to actually, do some concrete things that indicate an awareness and acceptance of the Shia community. But what I would like to say, as someone who actually did this work for a number of years, speaking to Laila's point, is that this is my own take as someone who was actually in this role, and Faiyaz or Abdul Malik or others who are doing this work may disagree with me. But my ideal when I did the work was to try to create the conditions where that person, who is part of my community can forget the fact that they're Muslim, can forget the fact that they're Shia, can forget the fact that they're Iranian, can forget the fact, and they can just do whatever it is that they came to the university to do, that they can study art, history, that they can study chemistry, that they can, do a play, they can experiment with yoga. I mean, whatever it is that kids do in college when they're 18 to 22 years old, that kid now feels like they can do any of that. And they don't have to, as Laila was saying, they don't have to study their religion all the time, promote their religion all the time, defend their religion all the time, put on programs for the religion all the time. And the fact of the matter is that the university administrations can't be the ones that we rely upon to make that happen. It has to come from the community. And as Laila said, like, we don't invest in that. I remember when, I was, one particular thing happened when I was a part of, where a bunch of Muslim community people wanted to get a bunch of money for another like K-8 Islamic school. And I was like, I went to some of the people and I said, listen, this money could literally fund like 10 full-time Muslim chaplain positions at colleges and universities across the country. And I guarantee you that those Muslim chaplains will have more impact on your kids' faith over those 4 years in college than, going through an Islamic school of K to 12 years old. From my experience, right? That will be more bang for your buck. More kids will be influenced if you have a compassionate and a learned person who is there for the kids, can help them through the traumas that they went through even before they got to college in the Muslim community. I mean, that was what I had to deal with. I had to deal with all the trauma that all the kids brought, that was outside the university. I became their, therapist, right? And so, that's a whole nother level, of the conversation that we haven't even touched, which is that, how a chaplain, can function in a way that, basically is shepherding someone from the age of 18 to 22, where they're going to either actively choose to make Islam a part of their life, actively deny that Islam is a part of their life, or have some middle ground where they're like, well, I don't want to go against my parents and my community, but I'm not really into this sort of thing. And so I'll kind of just, fudge it here and there. Like when I'm with my non-Muslim friends out in the world and my non-Muslim colleagues, I'll be one way. And when I go home, I'll be another way. That happens at that stage. And so I think that our Muslim community has to be aware of that and has to, recognize that we need to invest financially and invest intellectually in the support of Muslim college kids across the board, but Shia kids in particular. Hope that's helpful.
Thank you. And you gave me the perfect segue to ask Sheikh Faiyaz, what is something unique you learned about your role working with Shia students in your capacity at college campuses at NYU?
Oh, I learn a lot every day. And that's something really, really unique about, I think, the role walking in every day to the office and learning from those who I speak to, perhaps more than they learn from me. One thing I would say, Dave, is we're not allowed to call them kids. We have to call them adults, young adults. That's one thing I learned from day one. But I would probably say that the first and most important lesson that I continuously learn, and though I know it, it's a good reminder every day, is that every single individual has their own nuance and complexity to them. Though that they're, though that the larger Shia community across the world is, awfully diverse, and naturally the presence of Shia Muslims in the United States, and particularly on college campuses, is also diverse ethnically, racially, from SES and beyond. Just the fact that every single individual has their own unique experiences. And though we're not allowed to call ourselves counselors or therapists, being that, we don't have those degrees or qualifications, or at least I don't, speaking to students during the course of their 4 years and the amount of time that I spend with them, like Dave mentioned, that, everyone comes with a lot, and there's a lot of obstacles and challenges that everyone faces. And, when we talk about building the institution and we talk about sort of the importance of Shia chaplaincy work on, on any given college campus, there's a phrase that we often sort of, throw around, which is, the catering to the lowest common denominator. And I don't mean that sort of in a disrespectful way, but recognizing that we want to making sure that we're creating the most religiously inclusive space that we possibly can. And that requires then toward catering to the one who may know the least. And again, not in a bad way, but in a way that we're making sure that no one feels that they're not heard, or that no one feels that they don't have an opportunity to learn or to be in the gathering. So, that could mean that, in any given year, there's a student who, knew that, they were Muslim, or that they were Shia, but they've never prayed before, or that they don't know any of the tenets of the faith. We went to making sure that every single individual has an opportunity to learn and to grow in open space, because, the Center for Muslim Life at our given campus, we're not a mosque, but we sort of represent ourselves, or at least I like to think that the way that we at the Islamic Center at New York University represent ourselves is a sort of a hospital for hearts, right? We like to see ourselves as, some sort of spiritual physicians in some way, that anyone and everyone is welcome. We want everyone to feel that they have a unique entry point and access point toward finding a community, which can hopefully translate them into finding something far deeper, to have ma'rifah, to understanding themselves, understanding their creator, and in that most formative year during the course of during the most formative years during the course of their lives, which for most people is their college experience. It's an awfully incredible privilege and very humbling that that there's this opportunity to again serve this very nuanced, complex 18-year-old student the minute that they walk into the building and they sit in my office and they say, "I'm Shia." And I often what I tell them is, you're about to become my best friend for the next 4 years, whether you like it or not, and some of them, they run away and they never see me ever again after I say that, because they get scared. So I probably need to work on my language. And others are like Melanie, she's still around, alhamdulillah. And, hopefully she's able to do some big things. So yeah, I would say that the biggest lesson is just, again, the nuance and complexity with it, that everyone comes with, and the need, again, to cater to everyone within the community and allowing for their spiritual development, God willing.
Thank you, Sheikh Faiyaz. And thank you, Professor Coolidge, Shereen, and Laila, and all of our audience members who stuck around for our entire conference. And again, thank you to our co-sponsors and Steinhardt School of Education and the Luce Foundation. And unless anyone would like to add any closing remarks, thank you all again for joining us.
Thank you, Melanie, for facilitating and participating. And thanks to all the panelists as well.